A reporter stormed the stage to humiliate him. John Lennon did this, and the audience was shocked. New York City, October 1971. The Fillmore East, a cathedral of rock and roll, its walls soaked in the sweat and soul of 1,000 legendary performances. Tonight, it held something different. John Lennon stood at the microphone, bathed in the cold, honest glare of stage lights. He was performing a benefit concert for the victims of the Attica prison riot, a raw and politically charged event that had claimed 43 lives just weeks before. The audience was not the usual sea of screaming fans. These were activists, artists, journalists, and ordinary people united by grief and righteous anger. People who had come not just to hear music, but to feel something real. The air was thick, heavy with cigarette smoke, burning political conviction, and the particular electricity of a room full of people who believed that art could change the world. John believed it too. He had always believed it. He was in the middle of Working Class Hero, his voice stripped raw, each word a small, precise wound against the comfortable assumptions of power. The song had never sounded more urgent, more necessary, more dangerous. And danger, in certain rooms, in certain cities, in certain years, attracts predators. In the press section, 12 rows back from the stage, sat a man named Richard Cavanaugh. He was 47 years old, and a senior correspondent for a major New York tabloid, a veteran of 30 years covering the entertainment industry with the particular cynicism of a man who had seen too much to believe in anything anymore. Cavanaugh was not there to write a review. He was there to execute a plan he had been constructing for weeks, with the methodical precision of someone who understood that the most effective attacks are the ones delivered in public, where their target has nowhere to hide. He despised John Lennon, not personally, not because of any genuine grievance, but because Lennon represented something that Cavanaugh's readership had been trained to fear. A wealthy celebrity using his platform to challenge the status quo, to ask uncomfortable questions, to refuse the comfortable role of entertainer, and insist instead on being a citizen, an activist, a man with opinions that inconvenience people in power. Not Cavanaugh's editor had given him a simple directive: take Lennon down, find the crack in the armor, make him look like a fraud, a hypocrite, a man who preached peace while living in luxury, a foreigner telling Americans how to run their country. The column was already written. All Cavanaugh needed was a moment, a photograph, a quote, a reaction. He had decided to create one. As John reached the final verses of Working Class Hero, Cavanaugh rose from his seat. He adjusted his press badge. He straightened his jacket, and with the terrible calm of someone who has convinced himself of his own righteousness, he began moving toward the stage. The security was not prepared for this. They were watching the crowd, watching the exits, watching for the usual threats. They were not watching a middle-aged man in a press badge walking with professional confidence directly toward the stage steps. He reached them, he climbed them, and suddenly, impossibly, a reporter from a New York tabloid was standing on stage at the Fillmore East, microphone in hand, walking toward John Lennon with a smile that contained absolutely no warmth. The music faltered. The band saw him first, saw the confusion register on their faces, their fingers stumbling on strings and keys. The crowd murmured. The lights seemed to shift. John turned. He saw the man. He saw the press badge, the microphone, the smile. And in the split second before the reporter opened his mouth, John Lennon read the entire situation, every intention, every calculation, every ugly word that was about to be deployed against him in front of 1,000 witnesses. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary, least documented moments in the history of rock and roll. A reporter had stormed the stage to humiliate him, and John Lennon was about to do something that left the entire audience breathless. And to understand what happened that night at the Fillmore East, you have to understand the specific, calculated nature of Richard Cavanaugh's attack. This was not a spontaneous moment of journalistic passion. This was an ambush, planned, structured, and designed to exploit the one vulnerability that all performers share: the inability to control what happens when someone else has a microphone on your stage. Cavanaugh had done his homework. He had studied John's recent interviews, nor his public statements about the Vietnam War, his association with radical figures, his ongoing deportation battle with the Nixon administration. He had compiled a dossier of what he called contradictions. A working-class hero who lived in the Dakota, one of Manhattan's most exclusive apartment buildings. A peace activist who had famously lost his temper in interviews. A man who preached love while engaging in the very public, very messy dissolution of the Beatles. The questions Cavanaugh had prepared were not questions in any genuine journalistic sense. They were grenades, each one designed to detonate on contact, to force a reaction that could be photographed, quoted, and weaponized in print. He had also chosen his moment with care. A benefit concert for Attica victims was a high-profile, politically sensitive event. The audience would be watching John closely, ready to form opinions, ready to be disappointed if their hero showed any crack in the armor. If Lennon lost his temper, if he lashed out, if he said anything that could be construed as dismissive or hypocritical, the story would write itself. Cavanaugh had one more weapon, and it was perhaps his most effective. He had arranged for a photographer from his paper to be positioned near the stage, with instructions to capture any moment of conflict or distress on John's face. The image, whatever it showed, would run alongside the column. In 1971, this was not an unprecedented tactic. The relationship between the press and celebrities, particularly politically outspoken celebrities, was already a battlefield. Reporters understood the power they held. An unflattering photograph, a decontextualized quote, a carefully framed narrative. These were tools capable of genuine destruction. John Lennon understood this too. He had been navigating hostile press coverage since 1966, when his "more popular than Jesus" comment had triggered boycotts, record burnings, and death threats. He had watched the press misquote him, misrepresent him, and weaponize his own words against him. He had developed, out of necessity, a sophisticated understanding of how the machinery of tabloid journalism operated. But he had also developed something else, a deeply personal philosophy about how to respond when attacked. He had seen what happened when public figures met aggression with aggression. He had watched careers destroyed, not by the initial attack, but by the response. He had observed with the particular clarity of someone who had been a target many times that the most dangerous thing you could do when someone tried to make you into a villain was to behave like one. The night at the Fillmore East was a test of that philosophy, the most direct, most public, and most carefully engineered test he had ever faced. And as Richard Cavanaugh stepped onto the stage with his microphone and his smile, John Lennon made a choice. Not about what to do. He already knew what he was going to do. The choice was about how to do it. And in that choice, the entire story of that night was already written. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like that helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. Richard Kavanaugh reached John Lennon and stopped. He was close enough to shake hands, close enough to see the slight tightening around John's eyes, the only visible sign of the calculation happening behind them. The band had stopped completely. The audience, initially confused, was now alert with the particular animal instinct of a crowd sensing danger. Kavanaugh raised his microphone. His voice, amplified now by his own recorder, is cut through the silence with practiced professional authority. Mr. Lennon, Richard Kavanaugh, New York Tribune. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your qualifications to speak on behalf of American working people, given that you live in one of Manhattan's most expensive buildings and haven't worked a real job in your life. The question landed like a stone into still water. The ripples moved outward through the audience, a collective murmur of shock, then anger, and then the particular held breath of a room waiting to see what comes next. John Lennon did not speak. He stood completely still. His guitar hung at his side. His hands were relaxed. His face was unreadable in the way that faces become unreadable when someone is thinking very fast and very carefully beneath a surface of deliberate calm. Kavanaugh, interpreting the silence as hesitation, pressed forward. Furthermore, Mr. Lennon, do you consider it appropriate for a British citizen who is currently fighting deportation orders to use an American stage to make political statements about American domestic policy? Isn't that rather, shall we say, hypocritical? Still, John said nothing. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. The audience was absolutely motionless, their attention focused on John with an intensity that was almost physical. Kavanaugh smiled. He believed the silence meant he was winning. He was profoundly mistaken. John finally moved, not toward Kavanaugh, not away from him. He turned slowly to face the audience. His eyes swept across the 1,000 faces watching him, and in that sweep, something passed between him and the crowd. An acknowledgement, a shared understanding of exactly what was happening on this stage. Then he turned back to Kavanaugh. And when he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that the entire room instinctively leaned forward to hear it. Are you finished? 2 words, delivered without anger, without sarcasm, without the performance of strength. Just a genuine, simple question, asked with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. Kavanaugh, thrown slightly by the response, tried to recover. I have several more questions about your... I'm going to stop you there, John said, his voice still quiet, still measured, still utterly devoid of hostility. He looked at Kavanaugh for a long moment. Then he did something that no one in the room had anticipated. He gestured toward the microphone stand at the front of the stage. Come here, John said. Stand here with me. The invitation was so unexpected that Kavanaugh actually hesitated. His carefully constructed plan had no provision for this. He had anticipated anger, defensive,ness, perhaps a demand that he be removed from the stage. He had not anticipated an invitation to stand closer. The audience watched in complete silence as John Lennon gestured again, patient, unhurried. Kavanaugh, his instincts as a journalist overriding his prepared strategy, moved to stand beside John at the microphone. He told himself it was because this gave him a better position, a closer shot, more material. He didn't understand yet that he had just made the most significant mistake of the evening. John addressed the audience directly, his voice now carrying fully through the sound system. This man has some questions for me, and I think you should all hear them." He looked at Kavanaugh. "Go on then, ask them." Kavanaugh, suddenly aware that the dynamic had shifted in some fundamental way he couldn't quite articulate, cleared his throat. He repeated his first question about John's qualifications to speak for working people. John listened. He nodded slowly when it was finished. "That's a fair point," John said. The audience stirred. "I do live in an expensive building. I have more money than I'll ever need. And you're right that I've never worked a factory floor or swung a hammer." He paused, letting the admission breathe. "But I want to ask you something." He turned to face Kavanaugh directly, his eyes calm and steady. "The men who died at Attica, did any of them live in expensive buildings? Did their families choose to be poor? Did the guards who opened fire on them ask for documentation of their working-class credentials before they pulled the trigger?" Kavanaugh started to respond. John raised a hand, not aggressively, but with the quiet authority of a man who has earned the right to finish his thought. "You want to talk about hypocrisy? Let's talk about hypocrisy. I'm a rich man singing songs about inequality. That's a contradiction. I'll own that. But you are a man who earns his living by deciding whose pain is legitimate and whose isn't, by determining which voices deserve to be heard and which ones deserve to be silenced." He gestured toward the audience. "These people tonight, they didn't come here because of me. They came here because 43 people died, and someone thought music might help carry that weight. Do you want to tell them their grief is invalid because the person standing on this stage isn't poor enough?" The room was absolutely still. Kavanaugh tried to pivot to his second prepared question, the one about John's deportation battle, but something had changed. He could feel it. The room had shifted, imperceptibly, but completely, and he was no longer the interrogator. He was something else. He was the subject. Yet what happened next would be described differently by everyone who witnessed it. Some said it was the most devastating public humiliation they had ever seen, made more devastating by the fact that the person being humiliated was the one who had come to humiliate. Others said it was the most gracious moment they had ever witnessed on a stage. Both were right. John Lennon looked at Richard Kavanaugh, really looked at him, in the way that very few people look at each other in public, and with complete, unguarded attention, as if the reporter were the only other person in the room. "Can I ask you something?" John said, his voice so quiet it was almost intimate. "Not for the audience, just you and me." Kavanaugh, completely destabilized now, nodded. "What happened to you?" John asked. "Because nobody writes questions like that unless something happened to them, and nobody works that hard to prove that other people's pain isn't real unless they've spent a long time convincing themselves that their own pain isn't real either." The silence that followed was of a quality that rooms rarely achieve. 1,000 people holding themselves absolutely motionless, aware that they were witnessing something they had no framework for. Kavanaugh's face changed, a flash of something raw and unguarded crossing it before the professional mask slammed back into place. "No, that's not relevant," Kavanaugh said, his voice slightly hoarse. "Maybe not," John agreed, "but it's true." He turned back to the audience, his voice returning to its full strength. "You know, I've been doing this for a long time, playing music, getting up in front of people, trying to say something that matters. And the thing that never stops surprising me is how frightened people are of sincerity." He looked at Kavanaugh one last time. "Not you specifically, all of us. We've built whole industries around the idea that caring too much is embarrassing, that hope is naive, that the person who stands up and says things should be better is always the one who gets torn apart. He picked up his guitar. His hands found the opening chords of Imagine. "But I'll tell you what I've learned," John said, his voice dropping back to that quiet, intimate register that the microphone barely needed to carry. "The only thing that actually frightens power is love, not anger, not protest, love, because love is patient enough to outlast anything." He began to play, and Richard Cavanaugh, the reporter who had climbed a stage to destroy a man, stood at the edge of that stage for the entire song, his microphone at his side, his prepared questions unasked. His photographer, sensing something he didn't have words for, lowering his camera. By the time Imagine ended, the audience was not applauding in the usual sense. They were making a sound that was deeper than applause, a sound that came from somewhere below the chest. It was the sound of 1,000 people recognizing something true. Richard Cavanaugh never published the column. This fact, more than anything else about that night, became the most quietly discussed detail among those who were present. The man who had climbed a stage, armed with prepared questions, and a photographer who had constructed an ambush with professional precision, one who had the material and the mandate, chose not to publish. He told his editor that the story hadn't developed as anticipated. His editor, sensing something he preferred not to examine too closely, accepted this explanation and moved on to other targets. Cavanaugh himself was largely silent about the evening. In the years that followed, he gave only one interview in which he mentioned it, obliquely, to a journalism student who was writing a thesis on press ethics. "I went to that concert to prove something," Cavanaugh told the student. "I didn't prove what I intended to prove. I proved something else. I'm still thinking about what it was." He retired from journalism 3 years later. His colleagues described him as changed, in some way they couldn't precisely articulate, quieter, more careful with his words, less quick to reach for the sharpest available instrument. For John Lennon, the night at the Fillmore East became one of those experiences that settled deep into a person without immediate explanation. He spoke of it indirectly in interviews, never naming Cavanaugh, never describing the specifics. "I used to think the best response to attack was a better argument," he said in one 1972 interview. "I don't think that anymore. The best response is to just keep being what you are and let people see the difference." The concert itself, as the reason everyone had gathered that night, raised significant funds for the families of Attica victims. The music was recorded, though the tapes of the backstage confrontation remained private. Yoko Ono, watching from the wings throughout the entire episode, later described it as the moment she understood something fundamental about John that she had only previously intuited. "He could have destroyed that man," she said. "He had the audience. He had the moral ground. He had the wit. He could have taken him apart in front of everyone and walked away celebrated for it. The fact that he chose not to, that he chose something else entirely, that told me everything I needed to know." The members of the audience carried the memory in different ways. Some described it in terms of the music, others in terms of the confrontation. But a common thread ran through almost every account collected in the years that followed. They had arrived that night expecting to be moved by a performance. They had not expected to be changed by a demonstration of something rarer and more difficult than talent. Something that required, in the specific atmosphere of that specific year, in a country tearing itself apart over questions of power and truth, and who deserved to speak and who deserved to be heard, a particular and costly kind of courage. The the courage to respond to cruelty with curiosity, and to answer an attack not with a counterattack, but with a question asked in genuine good faith. What happened to you? 3 words, quiet enough that the microphone almost missed them, powerful enough that the man they were aimed at never forgot them. New York City, December 8, 1980. John Lennon was murdered 40 steps from his home. On a street he walked every day. The world broke in a way that worlds don't usually break. Not the sharp, clean break of sudden catastrophe, but the long but slow fracture of something that had been load-bearing without anyone fully understanding how much weight it carried. In the days and weeks that followed, the stories emerged, the thousands of private moments, the unreported kindnesses, the quietly deflected attacks, the choices made, again and again, to respond to the worst of human behavior with the most difficult and least dramatic of human responses: understanding. The night at the Fillmore East was one of those stories, and passed between people who were there, growing in the telling, not because it became embellished, but because its meaning deepened with time, the way certain experiences only reveal their full significance in retrospect. What John had done that night was not complicated. It did not require exceptional strength or unusual talent. It required only the willingness to see the person attacking you as a person. To ask, in the middle of being attacked, not what you could do to win, but what might be true about the person trying to make you lose. This is perhaps the most radical thing John Lennon ever did. More radical than his protest songs, his peace demonstrations, his battles with governments and record labels, and the entire machinery of institutional power. Because those battles, significant as they were, operated within a framework the world already understood. The framework of opposition, of us and them, of the right side and the wrong side. So what he did at the Fillmore East stepped outside that framework entirely. He looked at the man who had come to destroy him and asked, "What happened to you?" And in that question, he refused the role of victim, or hero, or symbol. He insisted quietly and without fanfare on being something more difficult and more enduring than any of those things. A human being interested in other human beings, even the ones holding weapons, even the ones who had decided he was the enemy, even the ones who had climbed his stage with a microphone and a column already written and a photographer positioned to capture his fall. The Fillmore East still stands. Its walls hold the echoes of 10,000 extraordinary nights. But somewhere in those walls, in the particular acoustic memory that old performance spaces develop over years of absorbing human sound, there is the echo of a single question, asked quietly, amplified by 1,000 witnesses, and carried forward by every person who heard it and recognized in it something they had been trying to articulate their entire lives. What happened to you? Not as an accusation, not as a deflection, but as a genuine, costly, irreducible act of interest in another person's pain. It is, in the end, what his music was always asking. It is, in the end, the question that outlasts everything else. No official record of that night mentions a reporter on stage. No column was ever published, and no photograph was ever printed. But 1,000 people carried the memory home. And some of them are still carrying it. A reporter with a microphone, a musician with a question, and the particular silence that falls over a room when someone chooses understanding in a moment specifically designed to make that impossible. The end. If this story about grace under attack, the courage of genuine curiosity, and the radical power of asking what happened to you instead of what can I do to win, moved you, subscribe and leave that powerful like below. Share this with someone who needs to hear that the most revolutionary thing you can do when someone tries to tear you down is to see them clearly and wish them well anyway. What moment in your life taught you that understanding someone is more powerful than defeating them? Tell us in the comments below.